You know, being a good neighbor requires us to see the humanity in everyone. We must be good neighbors because everyone has value and worth. We must be good neighbors because we are all together in our own community with different abilities and different senses of creativity, different gifts that God has bestowed on us. And God says, use that creativity, use those gifts as a good neighbor in your neighborhood and in your community. Jesus moves on in this passage to use an illustration of the child, saying, therefore, hey, the way you treat this child is the way you treat me. You ought to welcome a child as you would welcome anyone else. You ought to welcome someone who looks differently than you, walks differently than you, even believes differently from you, because when you do that, you are welcoming in the presence of God. It's a beautiful day in the neighborhood, but there's still work to do on this side. There's still work to do because there are black and brown bodies that have been incarcerated for marijuana usage, who now have to look and see others make millions of dollars by selling those same products. Beloved, we need to be good neighbors. When our denominations still only care about doctrines and principles and not the lives of the people within our own denominations, that is the question that tells us we need to be better neighbors. When our friends and others across this country are still grappling with massive student loan debt, at risk of evictions, layoffs, moratoriums, while we're still in a pandemic, this is the time to prove ourselves as neighbors, as good neighbors in this beloved community of God. And I myself have lived long enough, have seen enough that I myself want to be a good neighbor. I can stand where I'm standing today because someone was a good neighbor to me. I can preach what I preach and serve where I serve because someone was a good neighbor to me. Someone helped to feed me as a child. Someone in college when I didn't have the money was a good neighbor by putting money in my pocket. Somebody opened the door for me. This is the time not to look at the material and the titles, but to see that we ourselves are neighbors. And how beautiful that is, that we are neighbors, that we are in the same neighborhood, that we are in this beloved community of God. Good neighbor. When I was a student at STH a few years back, like many of you, I found myself struggling during a particular semester. It was during midterms, and it seemed like I must have had 100 papers to write.
That's right.
I went over to pavement, but I couldn't focus. So I went over to the STH library. I still could not focus. I went over to Mugard. There were too many undergrads, could not focus. So I found a bench to sit down on, and beloved, a classmate came up to me, a classmate with a different skin color than mine, a classmate with a different belief systems than mine. But that classmate said, "Art, you look stressed. How about I grab you a coffee?" And that might sound so small, but it was something about the gift of a coffee from a neighbor who saw me in tough times.
That's right.
That built something on the inside of me that said, not only can I get through, but I have the responsibility to do the same thing for someone else. STH community, won't you be a good neighbor? Won't you be a good neighbor today? We're still in a pandemic, but we can still be a good neighbor. We may not be able to do things as we used to, but we can still be a good neighbor. Things have shifted, things have changed, but we can still be a good neighbor. And today is the best day that we can chart a better course of being a neighbor within this community that God has created around us. And as I close, I'm reminded of a quick story. Earlier this year, as the vaccines were being rolled out, I volunteered my church to be a site where members of the community can get the vaccine. Many of you may or may not remember there were times when in black and brown communities there was not enough access. And so we made it by having it in a faith house, in a church, in our fellowship hall. And on this particular day, folks that came in to get the vaccine. I myself had already been vaccinated. I encouraged others to do it. And so I ended up going back upstairs to my office because I had to hop on a few Zooms on some legislative work we were doing in Congress. When I got a knock at the door, the knock was one of the deacons in the church. He says, "Pastor, I understand you're busy and that you're on a Zoom call, but there's a woman here. She's about 90 years old. She can barely see, but she wanted to see the pastor." And so I did like many of you guys. I put my Zoom with my camera off. To act like I was still there. And I went down, I saw she was in a wheelchair, and I saw that she really couldn't see, and I gave her a little half hug, didn't want to get too close, and she said, "Pastor, I'm glad to be here today."
That's right.
I said, "Oh, that's good. I see you came to get your vaccine." She says, "Yeah, I went back and forth, and at 90 years old, I thought, I don't know if I need it, but I decided I wanted to be a good neighbor."
That's right.
Because it wasn't about just keeping myself safe. It was about keeping others around me safe, keeping my grandchildren safe, keeping my home health aides safe, keeping the community safe. And so if taking a vaccine will keep me safe and keep others safe, I just want to be a good neighbor. And so I just stopped by to say, is there anybody who can say, I want to be a good neighbor today? And I want to do everything possible in my gifts and my creativity that God has bestowed upon me to speak up for those who cannot speak, to stand with those who've stood too long, to walk with those who are too tired. This is the day to be a good neighbor. And when we become good neighbors, we will find ourselves in a good neighbor. It's a beautiful day in this neighborhood. Won't you be my neighbor? God bless you.